The bank branch manager, Carolyn Porter, had exactly 10 minutes to reverse her career, but she spent those minutes screaming at the man who had just bought the bank. Mitchell Daniels, the fintech billionaire, sat silently in a gray t-shirt, observing the institution he now owned fail a basic test of human decency. She called the security guard to remove him. He simply reached for his phone and triggered the legal maneuver that fired her entire executive board. The story is just getting interesting. Subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. The time was 9:45 a.m., 20 minutes before the bank even officially opened its executive doors. The temperature outside was a sharp, biting 45 degrees, but inside Sterling Reserve Bank, the air was temperature-controlled, still, and scented faintly of polished stone and old paper. Mitchell Daniels, the CEO of Ethelgard Global, walked through the revolving glass entry, deliberately moving past the brass plaque that announced the institution's 115th year of operation. He was not wearing a tailored suit, a tie, or any of the corporate armor that usually defined him. Instead, he wore a simple, premium gray t-shirt, jeans that had seen countless hours on a plane, and a pair of clean, unbranded sneakers. This was his uniform for today, a self-imposed invisibility cloak. Mitchell wasn't here for an ordinary meeting. He was here for the final, decisive board session that would rubber stamp his company's hostile takeover of Sterling Reserve's parent holding group. He had arrived early, not for preparation, but for a final, crucial inspection. He needed to see the unvarnished truth, the kind of institutional culture that glossy annual reports and sanitized branch visits never revealed. He wanted to know how this bank treated someone they perceived as powerless, someone who wasn't immediately identifiable as a member of the elite financial class. His presence was subtle, a dark silhouette against the vast expanse of white marble flooring, yet his intent was profound. He was putting the entire institution to a silent, personal test. He paused near the security partition, taking in the scene. The place hummed with a quiet, predictable wealth. The glass walls reflected the crisp lines of the trading desks and the hushed, almost reverent way the early staff moved. There were laminated posters strategically placed near the teller lines, touting the bank's commitment to diversity in finance and community inclusion. The contrast between those printed claims and the reality he was there to observe was what truly interested him. He knew the numbers on the balance sheet. Today, he was auditing the soul of the organization. He glanced down at his wrist, but there was no luxury watch, another intentional omission. The minute hand of the clock on the wall crept toward the hour, and he began his slow walk toward the executive service desk, portfolio, a thin, black leather folder holding the final, signed acquisition documents, in hand. His purpose wasn't to argue or to prove himself. It was to observe the reaction, to let the institution's entrenched bias speak for itself. He was ready for the test to begin. Mitchell stepped away from the perimeter, his thin black portfolio held loosely at his side. He approached the main service counter, an imposing stretch of polished granite that separated the client floor from the bank staff. The morning rush hadn't started yet, leaving only a handful of employees preparing for the day. He saw the executive desk clearly marked, a place for high-value clients and scheduled appointments, and walked straight toward it. Behind the desk was Carolyn Porter, the branch manager, easily identifiable by her focused, almost severe demeanor and the tiny, silver manager pin on her lapel. She had blonde hair pulled back tightly and features that seemed permanently set in an expression of sharp assessment. She was engrossed in adjusting a stack of documents, completely ignoring the approaching customer. Mitchell stood patiently for a few seconds, affording her the courtesy of finishing her task, but she gave no indication of noticing him. He finally cleared his throat gently. "Excuse me," he said, his voice measured and professional. "I have a scheduled meeting with the senior board members this morning." Carolyn's head snapped up. Her focus wasn't on him as a client, but as an interruption. Her eyes, sharp and judgmental, swept over his simple gray t-shirt and jeans, a look of immediate annoyance replacing her concentration. She didn't bother checking a terminal or a ledger. She simply saw an unsuited black man at the executive desk and made a rapid, dismissive assumption. "We don't take walk-ins at this desk," she stated, the volume of her voice just loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding staff. She didn't ask his name or confirm his appointment. And if you're here about a general inquiry, the retail counter is over there. She pointed with a dismissive jab of her chin toward the general line, clearly mistaking him for someone trying to open a basic account or, worse, complain about a low balance. Mitchell remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable. I assure you, this is an official, scheduled board matter, he repeated, his tone slightly firmer now. My meeting is with the senior members of the holding company. Carolyn leaned slightly forward on the counter, her hostility becoming palpable. She let out a small, short exhale of impatience. Look, I'm busy. I'm sure you do, she sneered, making the words sound like a patronizing lie. Her sharp features seemed to tighten. But I need you to move. You're holding up the operations. She reached her hand out and pointed a stiff, accusatory finger directly toward the retail area, deliberately cutting him off and refusing to acknowledge his words. The lack of respect, the immediate assumption of his inferiority, was the exact data point Mitchell had come to gather. The test was failing, miserably and publicly. The sound of his voice and Carolyn's rising tone had drawn the attention of Security Officer David, a large, tightly uniformed man who had been monitoring the floor near the entrance. Officer David began to move toward the counter, his posture instantly adopting an air of physical authority. The confrontation had officially been escalated by the institution itself. Carolyn Porter, fueled by the immediate assumption that she was dealing with a non-compliant, low-value customer, refused to back down. Her voice rose another octave, carrying across the hushed lobby. I told you, we are handling executive affairs right now. I don't care what you think you're scheduled for. You don't look like a scheduled client. You're interrupting. Her dismissal wasn't just rude. It was a public judgment of his worth based entirely on his casual attire and race. Mitchell did not raise his voice. His stillness was unnerving, an unmoving force against her escalating aggression. He simply held her gaze, a deep, silent authority emanating from him that contrasted sharply with her frantic energy. He was giving her every opportunity to pause, to check her system, to correct her mistake. I am here for the final board meeting, Mitchell stated, his voice a low counterpoint to her sharpness. I suggest you verify my name immediately. This only intensified Carolyn's frustration. She slammed her hand down lightly on the granite counter, the small thud loud in the quiet space. We don't get demands from the general public. You're clearly not understanding me. Move. She pointed her finger, a visual echo of the reference image, rigidly toward the exit line, her face a mask of indignation. Her prejudice had fully taken the lead, clouding any professional instinct. At that moment, Security Officer David reached the counter, his presence immediately dominating the space. He was built thick and imposing in his uniform, and he stepped directly in front of Mitchell, creating a physical barrier between the CEO and the manager. The action was swift, deliberate, and undeniably aggressive. Sir, you heard the manager, Officer David said, his voice flat and commanding. He didn't ask questions. He simply reinforced the bank's authority. You are causing a disturbance at the executive desk. You need to clear this area now. The scene was now a hostile standoff. The branch manager was shouting orders. The security officer was physically blocking him, and the CEO of the bank's parent company was being treated as a trespasser. A few of the junior staff glanced over, then quickly averted their eyes, choosing silence and self-preservation over intervention. Mitchell took a slow, deliberate breath. He looked past the aggressive security guard, past the furious branch manager, and out into the vast, silent lobby. He had the data he needed. The profound failure of integrity and culture was now a verifiable, real-time event. The bank had failed the test of basic human decency, and the observation phase was complete. Mitchell Daniels allowed the security officer, David, to take a step closer, physically encroaching on his space. He recognized the maneuver, a deliberate show of force intended to intimidate and compel immediate compliance. Mitchell did not flinch, his body language remaining utterly unyielding, which only seemed to frustrate Carolyn Porter further. He let the silence stretch, not out of fear, but out of calculation. He used the few seconds of tense standoff to perform the true purpose of his visit, the silent assessment. His eyes moved methodically across the floor. He saw a young teller at a remote station glance up, catch his eye, and immediately look back down at her screen, pretending to be absorbed in work. He saw two older women waiting in the general seating area who averted their gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the disturbance but unwilling to risk intervention. He noted the stiff, almost indifferent posture of another bank employee near the water cooler. This was the culture. This quiet complicity and immediate willingness to defer to authority, even when that authority was being openly and aggressively discriminatory. The entire institutional structure, from the aggressive branch manager and the imposing security officer to the silent, complicit floor staff, had created a hostile environment based purely on his misjudged appearance. Mitchell's mind was not racing with anger. It was processing data. The financial cost of maintaining this toxic environment was catastrophic for a company aiming for global influence. The ethical cost was unacceptable. He had confirmation of what the bank's internal reports had failed to disclose, a systemic failure of integrity. He took a slow step back, signaling not retreat, but a shift in phase. Officer David, clearly expecting a verbal argument or physical resistance, looked momentarily confused. Mitchell didn't say a word to either the guard or Carolyn. His silence now conveyed a chilling, final verdict. He turned and walked with measured, unhurried steps toward a row of leather seating near the window, his back perfectly straight. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what they were thinking. He finally gave up. He was just a low-level problem after all. He sat down, his black portfolio resting lightly on his knees. He looked not at the room, but out the window, his gaze focused on the cityscape. The time for observation was over, and the time for execution had arrived. The board meeting was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. He still had 15 minutes to act. The next move would not be polite, and it would not be a request. It would be a corporate demolition. Mitchell sat down on the leather bench, the cool material offering no comfort against the burning confirmation of his institutional assessment. Carolyn Porter, satisfied that she had properly handled the disturbance, was already turning back to her desk, the faint, triumphant smirk on her face a final insult. Security Officer David maintained his rigid posture for a few seconds longer, a satisfied enforcer of the bank's unspoken rules, before resuming his post. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, not for the thick acquisition portfolio, but for his personal phone. It was a secure, heavily encrypted device, the lifeline to Ethelgard's legal and financial war room. He ignored the various congratulatory messages and market alerts that flashed across the screen. He needed one contact, Liam Chun, his chief counsel and the architect of the entire takeover. Mitchell brought the phone to his ear, his back to the room, his voice barely a murmur, a stark contrast to Carolyn's earlier shouting. He didn't waste time on formalities. Liam, he began, his tone ice cold, I'm on site. The assessment is complete. There was a brief, professional acknowledgement from the other end. Liam knew what this meant. The entire legal team had been on standby for the past hour, ready to move the final paperwork. The institutional integrity test failed miserably, Liam. Systemic failure at the branch level. I want the immediate, public execution of the legal maneuver we discussed. The move was simple, but devastating. The final, certified release of the documents confirming Ethelgard's majority stake in Sterling Reserve's parent holding company, simultaneously delivered to the stock exchange, the bank's central corporate office, and the meeting room where the board members were currently waiting. It was the legal equivalent of a tactical nuclear strike. Confirming, Liam's voice crackled back. Final filings released to the necessary regulatory and internal channels. The board meeting in 5 minutes will be notified. Sir, this is irreversible. It's necessary, Mitchell countered, his eyes scanning the diversity in finance poster again, the hypocrisy sickeningly apparent. He was not going to argue with the branch manager or the guard. He was simply going to remove the entire structure that allowed them to operate with such impunity. One more thing, Liam, Mitchell added, his voice gaining a hard edge. Immediately draft the termination notices for the entire executive board of this branch, effective immediately. And specifically, the branch manager, Carolyn Porter, and the security officer, David. Cite catastrophic failure of corporate governance and documented discrimination. He ended the call without waiting for a reply. The entire process, from dialing to termination order, took less than 60 seconds. He placed the phone back in his pocket. He was no longer just an observer. He was the executor. The minutes were ticking down to 10:30 a.m., and the true power dynamic of the Sterling Reserve Bank was about to be irrevocably inverted. The hands on the bank lobby clock were closing in on 10:25 a.m. Mitchell sat observing the subtle panic that was just beginning to ripple through the executive floor. Even though the staff on the ground floor, Carolyn Porter included, remained blissfully unaware of the corporate earthquake he had just initiated. He knew the internal notification system was flashing red alerts about the Ethelgard acquisition, but the final, public shoe had yet to drop. Suddenly, the calm of the bank was broken by a decisive flurry of movement at the main entrance. The doors swung open, and three figures burst in, all dressed in high-end, tailored suits, their faces etched with a combination of speed and palpable stress. They were immediately recognizable as the senior management of the bank's local operation and the executives he was scheduled to meet. Leading the frantic group was Alastair Finch, the chairman of the Sterling Reserve Bank Board, a man whose face was usually a mask of aristocratic composure. Today, however, Alastair's skin was pale, and his brow was furrowed with urgent confusion. Flanking him were Richard Voss, the head of commercial lending, and Eleanor Hayes, the chief compliance officer. They weren't running, but their pace was sharp and frantic, clearly indicating a severe, unexpected crisis. They were late for the very meeting Mitchell had come to attend, and their current state suggested they had been yanked from another emergency huddle. They didn't spare a glance for the general floor staff, their eyes fixed on the executive elevators. The moment they stepped into the lobby, they began talking over each other in tense, low-pitched whispers, dominated by Alastair's agitated voice. "I still don't understand how Ethelgard finalized the position so fast. Voss, did your team miss something in the regulatory filing? We were supposed to have another 48 hours. They were so focused on the internal crisis, driven by the notification of the acquisition that Mitchell's single phone call had triggered, that they failed to register the man sitting quietly by the window." Alastair Finch abruptly stopped his internal monologue mid-sentence. His eyes, sweeping the room for an available attendant, finally landed on the casually dressed figure seated nearby. He saw a man who had clearly been waiting and was now occupying a premium spot. Without recognizing the face, Alastair instinctively moved toward him, not for a greeting, but to bark a quick instruction. "Excuse me," Alastair started, his tone imperious and hurried. "We need this area clear. Board meeting in process. And could you tell the branch manager to?" He froze. His words died in his throat as his brain finally registered the face, the posture, and the undeniable identity of the man in the gray t-shirt. The man he had just been discussing, the architect of the hostile takeover, the CEO of Ethelgard Global, Mitchell Daniels, was sitting in the bank lobby. The executives behind him stumbled to a halt as Alastair's panicked silence compelled them to look. The clock had run out, and the executive team had rushed straight into the middle of the confrontation. Alastair Finch's face, moments ago contorted by the stress of an unforeseen corporate acquisition, now registered a deeper, more primal form of dread. He didn't just recognize the man in the gray t-shirt. He realized where that man was and what had just transpired. The urgent internal crisis he was rushing to solve had literally been sitting in his lobby, observing his staff's profound failure. Mr. Daniels," Alastair stammered, the name emerging as a choked whisper of disbelief. The two executives behind him, Voss and Hayes, finally caught up. They stopped dead, their eyes going wide as they registered the fintech billionaire, their new majority owner, casually seated in the middle of a lobby confrontation. The whispers about the Ethelgard acquisition suddenly took on a very public and personal dimension. Mitchell Daniels stood up slowly, deliberately. The simple act of rising instantly inverted the power dynamic in the entire room. He was calm, composed, and utterly authoritative. His gaze bypassed the panicked executives and settled, cold and razor-sharp, on Carolyn Porter, the branch manager, who was now staring in horror, her previous arrogance dissolving into pure terror. "Alastair," Mitchell acknowledged the chairman with a voice that was level and devoid of emotion. "You're late. And I see you missed my introductory demonstration." Alastair looked frantically from Mitchell to Carolyn, the pieces of the puzzle crashing together in his mind, the casual attire, the delay, the branch manager's aggressive posture. He looked physically ill. "Mr. Daniels, I can assure you there has been a misunderstanding." The branch manager, There is no misunderstanding, Alistair. Mitchell interrupted, cutting him off with the finality of a gavel striking wood. He did not raise his voice, yet the sound silenced everyone in the immediate vicinity. I scheduled this early arrival for one purpose: to assess the unvarnished culture of the institution I was about to acquire. My team informed me that despite the diversity in finance posters you so proudly display, Mitchell gestured toward the laminated printout with a sweep of his hand, that this bank has a profound, systemic problem with integrity and respect. Mitchell stepped closer to the executive group, his eyes locking onto Alistair Finch's. For the past 10 minutes, your branch manager, Carolyn Porter, and your security officer, David, failed to verify my appointment, openly judged my worth based on my appearance, and publicly treated me as a disruptive, low-value nuisance. They demonstrated overt prejudice and a catastrophic lack of professionalism. And the rest of your staff stood by, silent and complicit. He paused, letting the devastating facts sink into the chairman's mind. You rushed in here worried about the paperwork, Mitchell continued. I am here to tell you that the paperwork is finished. The acquisition is finalized. Ethelgard Global now holds the controlling interest in your parent holding company. I am not your partner, Alistair. I am your majority owner, which makes me the effective boss of the entire board. The revelation hung in the air, a physical weight that crushed the remaining composure of the executives. Carolyn Porter let out a small, suppressed gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. The power shift was absolute, swift, and brutal. The man they dismissed was now the man who signed their paychecks and their termination papers. Mitchell Daniels took a slow, purposeful step toward the counter, his eyes fixed on Carolyn Porter, who was now frozen in a tableau of sheer, public humiliation. Her face had lost all its color, the sharp features dissolving into a look of absolute defeat. Security Officer David stood rigid, his training locking him in place, but his gaze was flicking desperately between the CEO and the chairman. Ms. Porter, Mitchell began, his voice perfectly measured, allowing no hint of triumph, only finality. Effective immediately, your employment with Sterling Reserve Bank and any affiliated entity under Ethelgard Global is terminated. Carolyn tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but no sound emerged. The grounds are gross misconduct, documented discrimination, and a profound failure of basic professional service. This decision is non-negotiable and irreversible. Your access to all bank systems is already revoked. You will report to HR for severance processing, but not another minute of your employment will be paid for time spent within this institution. He then shifted his attention to the large, silent guard. Security Officer David, your uniform represents the protection of all clients and the bank's integrity. Today, you used it to intimidate a client based on the branch manager's prejudice, failing to uphold that mandate. You are also terminated, effective immediately. He nodded curtly toward the exit. Leave the uniform here and vacate the premises. Neither Carolyn nor the guard offered resistance. They were paralyzed by the stunning rapidity of the corporate execution. The power of a single signature, backed by billions in assets, was now fully manifest. The real target, however, was the leadership. Mitchell turned to Alistair Finch, the chairman, and the two stricken executives, Richard Voss and Eleanor Hayes. And as for the board of this local branch, Mitchell said, sweeping his arm out to indicate the entire executive committee responsible for this location. A culture of prejudice does not spring up overnight. It is cultivated by leadership that is either blind or complacent. Your failure to instill a culture of respect, to monitor basic professional integrity, and your complicity in allowing that anti-client environment to flourish makes your leadership untenable under Ethelgard's ownership. He leaned in slightly, his tone dropping a degree further into the realm of absolute coldness. As the new majority owner, I am invoking the right to immediately restructure the local leadership. The entire executive branch board is dismissed, effective immediately. You failed the moment you tolerated selective service within these walls, and you ratified that failure by being late to the meeting that sealed your fate. Alistair Finch tried one last, desperate appeal. Mr. Daniels, please, we can correct this. We can issue a formal apology. We can fire them ourselves. We can. You can accept the consequences of your corporate negligence. Mitchell finished sharply. The termination documents for all of you have been filed with legal counsel. You will receive them shortly. My team will manage the transition. Your meeting is over." Mitchell Daniels had delivered the corporate death blow in less than 3 minutes. The board members, stripped of their power and their positions, stood stunned, having rushed to a meeting only to find their executioner waiting for them in the lobby. The entire financial hierarchy of the branch had been vaporized by a man wearing a t-shirt and jeans. Mitchell Daniels looked at the stunned, silenced group before him. Carolyn Porter, the branch manager, was weeping silently, her professional veneer shattered. Security Officer David stood immobile, his career dissolving around him, and Alastair Finch, the chairman, looked like he was about to suffer cardiac arrest. The sheer magnitude of his swift, total corporate dismantling had paralyzed them. He knew what they wanted to hear. They wanted a justification, an explanation that would soften the economic blow and the personal shame. He gave them a final statement, one that was not an apology for his actions, but a definition of their consequences. "Let me be clear," Mitchell stated, his voice ringing with a cold, clear authority that had been utterly absent when he first approached the counter. "This is not personal spite. This is not petty retaliation for a few minutes of disrespect. This is a required cleanup. Ethelgard Global does not invest billions of dollars into institutions that are structurally flawed at the cultural level." He pointed back toward the row of desks where the silent staff was pretending to work, their heads bowed low. The toxic culture that allowed this public display of discrimination to occur, the culture that allowed your employees to refuse service to a man based on assumptions of race and class, while your other staff watched and remained silent, that is a liability. That is an unacceptable risk to our brand and our capital. He walked toward the exit, his movements unhurried, leaving the terminated executives and staff in his wake. "Accountability must start at the top," he declared, his final words echoing in the vast, still lobby. "You, the executive board, are responsible for the environment you cultivate. You tolerated a system of selective respect, and today, that system failed its ultimate stress test." He paused at the revolving door, glancing back at the wreckage. "The immediate restructuring begins now. Liam Chun, my chief counsel, will be on site within the hour to implement the transitional management. Your authority is gone." He pushed through the glass door and stepped out into the crisp morning air, leaving behind the hushed, shattered remains of the Sterling Reserve Bank's local leadership. The sound of the door revolving shut behind him was the final, definitive marker. The systemic prejudice of the branch had been met, not with a complaint or an argument, but with the cold, hard, and undeniable power of corporate execution. Mitchell Daniels walked away, having proved his core belief. The culture of an institution is its true ultimate consequence. And that's the powerful, definitive end of the line for Sterling Reserve Bank's negligent leadership. Mitchell Daniels didn't just win a confrontation. He executed a precise corporate judgment, proving that integrity, not just investment, is the ultimate bottom line for true power. The entire branch learned the hard way that when you disrespect the client, your customer becomes your consequence. What do you think of Mitchell's stunning move? Should the entire board have been fired, or was his action too extreme? Drop your take in the comments below. If you were absolutely gripped by this story of hidden power, real-life corporate drama, and instant accountability, make sure you don't miss our next video. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you get every thrilling true life story delivered straight to your feed. Your support keeps us bringing you the best in high-stakes narratives.